Well, since we have a pretty small group, I'm going to go through this maybe a little faster than I normally would, and we've got extra time here, so I just assume we just have a discussion and talk about things. Appreciate the last presentation. Certainly, as I get older, don't like to admit that, but as I get older and get more arthritis in my hands, there's a couple of those things that were on the sheet that I thought were really good about, and especially grabbing things and lifting things that I think would really be helpful. So that was good. This is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about sorghum checkoff and NSP. Again, kind of talking to the choir here, but a little bit about that. Silage corn and sorghum. I'm not going to spend much time. That's a whole nother presentation, but just wanted to kind of introduce you to that a little bit. Going to spend a lot of time on seeding rate and how we come about getting a recommendation for seeding rate. And certainly that's open for discussion. I mean, agronomy is local. I mean, you can go over one county and things change. And so here's somebody coming from Amarillo, and I'm going to tell you how to do it, right? So, have some discussion maybe on that. I try to gear these things to where I'm at locally, but again, I'm not here. I don't know all your issues, and that makes a difference. And then talk a little bit about the grass control and the new technologies. So we'll get right into this. So sorghum checkoff and NSP, there's always confusion on those two organizations. What are they? How do they differ? We actually have one CEO, Tim Lust, which makes us a little bit different from most of the other commodities. So, we very much try to work together, the two groups, but we are very, very much different and have a different calling. The sorghum checkoff, I'm 100% checkoff. We do research, education, and promotion. That's what we do. A lot of market development. We have 4 people hired just for marketing and different segments of marketing, and they do a great job. We cannot lobby, so I have to be very careful with that. In fact, my presentation typically has to get approved by USDA AMS. When I give a presentation or I write something, usually not a big deal. If I just make some minor changes in a presentation, I'm not going to submit it. But what they're looking for is making sure I'm not trying to influence policy in some way or say negative things about other crops. I mean, I can compare corn to sorghum or soybeans as long as I have the data to back it up, but I can't run down, that commodity, for example. If you're with NSP, you can say and do whatever you want, basically, which can be kind of nice. But they're policy oriented. They're your representative in DC. Do a great job, and when you really look at the dollars that NSP brings to the farmer, it's pretty remarkable. And but they do, again, legislative stuff, regulatory stuff, where maybe I get involved a little bit with that. NSP or even EPA can ask me a question and I can answer it. So I can, be an advisor from that standpoint. But they are very, very much 2 different organizations. The funding is different. If you farm sorghum, then a very small amount, pennies per bushel, go to sorghum checkoff to fund what we do. Funds my salary. So I tell people all the time, don't be hesitant to call me if you got a question, just want to discuss something. I work for you, so don't hesitate to do that. 15 to 25% of that money that we have goes back to the state that it came from. So that's important, and really it's 25%. I think when everything was approved way back when, it was 15 to 25%, but as long as I've been a part of the checkoff, it's always been 25% goes back to the state. So the state can have their own priorities and do things with that money. From a leadership standpoint, we have 13 board of directors staggered on 3-year terms. You can serve 2 terms. 5 of those seats go to Kansas because they're the largest grain sorghum producer. Texas is the second, so we get 3. And then 1 goes to whatever's the 3rd, and that can kind of vary between the states. But I can say Nebraska has always been, since I've been on the board, has always been represented on the board, on the checkoff board, and had some very good board of directors over the years from Nebraska. NSP, anybody really can be a member of NSP. You pay a membership due, which is very nominal. I forget exactly what it is. It used to be 65. Is it more than that now?
I don't know, there's levels.
Different levels. Okay, but it, not a lot that it costs to be a member. And then certainly you can make donations, and companies provide money to support NSP. So a lot of different funding sources actually from the NSP side. They also have a completely different set of board of directors. Okay, that basically tell them what to do from a policy standpoint. Education and communication, again, different. Each has their own newsletters that go out. If you don't get these from NSP or Sorghum Checkoff, let us know, especially on the checkoff side. Monthly email go out, agronomy update that I do, which roughly goes, and that's more really for crop consultants or whoever wants it basically, but it's kind of geared more towards crop consultants. Goes out maybe once, maybe twice a month, depending on what's kind of going on during the year. Is where that agronomy update comes from. The Sorghum Grower magazine, hopefully all of you get that. Really nice resource that goes to producers. We're going to mention Simply Sorghum. I always forget that, but that's a fairly new website that we have that's really geared towards the food segment, which is very much growing. Has all kinds of recipes and nutritional information, and if you got somebody who's interested in that side of it, this is a really good resource. It's Simply Sorghum that I wanted to mention. We're going to talk real quickly about some projects that we fund, and I'm not going to, from an agronomy side, there's a lot of marketing stuff that we also fund, but from an agronomy side, I wanted to mention a couple of projects. Again, a lot more than this. Talked about some different ones last year. One project that we funded that's significant dollars, I want to say it's like a $500,000 project, developing sorghums with enhanced protein digestibility. Mitch Tynstra is a breeder at Purdue. Actually was the breeder at Kansas State for a number of years. Went to Purdue some time ago, but still has a very active breeding program, does a great job. And he's got a nice program looking at protein digestibility and lysine content. Those are certainly desirable traits that we'd like to see incorporated in sorghum. So he's making some really good progress on that. The second one is a project that we started 2 years ago with Innovative Seed Solutions. If you're not familiar with Innovative Seed Solutions, they're the seed company kind of that's behind the scenes for a number of companies, mostly Bayer, your DCAB, your Channel, a lot of other, for example, I'm sure Beck and others are getting a lot of their genetics now from Innovative Seed Solutions. They're probably clearly, as far as the amount of seed being planted across the U.S., they're clearly the leader, really, in the amount of seed that's being planted. But anyway, we're doing a project with them looking at iron deficiency, chlorosis tolerance, which really is a big deal, bigger than you start adding up the amount of acres and the loss in yield from this, it's pretty high actually. We think it probably affects at least 2 million acres. This is a trait that's very difficult to work with, but we're working directly with them. They also kind of have an agreement with Kansas State that's kind of part of this, but all to develop eventually hybrids that are going to have much better iron chlorosis tolerance. And that'll be a good thing if we can get there. Another one that I wanted to mention, biological nitrification inhibition. This is a project at Texas A&M. We're funding it. The Texas board actually is also putting in some money to fund this particular project. They have some federal grants. But what this is doing is, in the soil, once you put nitrogen in that soil, things begin to happen to that nitrogen. So you go from, when you're putting out ammonia or whatever you're putting out, you go from NH3 to nitrite to nitrate. Nitrate is primarily what's taken up by the plant, although some ammonia can be taken up. But what this does, it keeps that nitrogen more in that ammonium form, which the plant can take up. And there's been some research on the ratio of those two, that to nitrate can be important. But more importantly, it prevents nitrous oxide emissions. Okay, so you lose nitrogen from the soil. Okay, a certain percentage of that, which is bad for the environment, but it's also bad for you just from a standpoint of you're losing nitrogen that could otherwise go to the plant. Okay, so sorghum actually exudes a material called sorgoleone. You may have read about that occasionally. It has all kinds of various properties, but one thing it does do, it very much decreases the conversion of that nitrate to nitrous oxide. Okay, and also helps prevent leaching too, which is another thing. So the idea behind this is we can develop hybrids that have this trait. From your standpoint, you don't have to use as much nitrogen. Okay, so it's going to cut the cost. And then if we eventually get paid from a sustainability standpoint and carbon and all those things, and just, the nitrous oxide emissions is a very big deal if we can lower that. And not going to go into detail on these graphs, but that's basically what they're doing with that study. Again, there's a lot of other studies that we're funding that I'm not going into today. This is a new one that the board just funded this last year, and I want to mention it because Nebraska will have a part in this. Reappraisal of sorghum growing degree days, a regional approach. Well, as with all crops, you predict the growth and development of those plants based primarily on heat units. We know with sorghum, the formula we're using is just not very good. I mean, sorghum is affected more than really by just heat units. Certainly the length of day, I think, has something to do with it. So as you move north, day gets longer, that's got to have some effect. I think not temperatures, I think, clearly have an effect. Elevation, we know makes an effect. So there's various other things that go into this. We need a better, basically, formula, if you will, to predict the growth and development of sorghum. So we're funding a project this year. It's going to involve, several states. Again, Nebraska being one of them, where we'll have a location and we'll be tracking the growth and development of sorghum over the growing season, and looking at all the factors that maybe affect that to eventually come up with a much better, we think, model on predicting growth and development. There'll be 2 planting dates on this, and then we'll also, I think, test 4 hybrids at a minimum on this. So something we've been needing to do for a while, and I'm glad to see that we're finally going to do that because it's just something that's very much needed, I think, by the industry. It's kind of one of those things that you don't really think about or think makes much difference. Because we rely especially more on models to tell us how to farm. This is going to be important. Quickly about sorghum and corn silage. Again, this could be easy an hour-long presentation, but I'm just going to touch on a couple of things with the feed yard industry and especially dairies in western Kansas and in Texas Panhandle. This is getting to be a big deal. Corn has certainly been the traditional choice for silage, and for good reason. I mean, corn makes a good quality product. It's very consistent. Good yields under good conditions. Pretty forgiving from a harvest timing standpoint. Where silage sorghum, you really need to harvest it on time. So there's certainly some advantages to corn. The disadvantages to corn, it does require a lot of water, and so at least a lot of the silage sorghum and corn is irrigated. As we aren't able to do as much of that and we have less water, this is becoming a much bigger deal. And so in some cases, especially in the Texas Panhandle and Southwest Kansas, it's getting to the point you just don't have a lot of choice. You're going to have to start thinking about silage sorghum or something different because of the water requirement. I think it's always interesting when you have a drought year and corn is stressed and it isn't making much grain. Then the thought is, oh well, I'll just take it to the feed yard or even to the dairy, and that's a lot of times what is done. From a feed yard standpoint, probably fine because they're mostly interested in just that roughage. Dairies, not so much. But if you look at corn, and there's 2 different hybrids here that were planted, and you got with the year and without the year. And the point here is to show if you don't have grain, how that affects yield as well as quality. Corn is very dependent from a yield standpoint and from a quality standpoint on that grain. So we dropped seven tons here in both cases with both varieties. when we don't have those kernels being developed, made. The quality, same thing. We're dropping from almost 3,000 milk tons here, with the year to half of that. So that it just makes a huge difference. So again, the point is, if you don't have the water, you need to start thinking about silage sorghum. And of course, the way you manage that is going to be quite a bit different. So one thing that is done just outside of Amarillo, Jordan Bell is an agronomist that does this trial, but she has roughly 65 to 75 silage sorghum hybrids she tests every year in fact, it's with a farmer, it's under his pivot. And so it's under his conditions. She also puts in corn in that trial. So you have a direct comparison. So this is just showing the yields in 2021. The top yield was 32 tons with one of the silage sorghums. What's in red is the 3 corn hybrids that were in there. And so they were kind of in the middle. Okay, you can see in this particular case, 8 inches of in-season precipitation, and they put on a little over 8 inches of water on this. So it's irrigated for sorghum. And this was what I would call more or less an average year. If the year would have been better, where they had more rainfall, those corn hybrids would have been at the top because they had more rain. If it had been a drier year that we get into sometimes, they'd have been towards the end. Okay, so again, corn's going to be much more dependent on that than what silage sorghum can be, and especially the timing of that water to some extent. Silage sorghum, when you plant it and it starts growing and it gets under dry stress, it'll just kind of stop, and just kind of sit there. And a good example is that 2 years ago, I saw some silage sorghum, and a lot of growers were just abandoning it and just hanging it because they thought, hey, it's burned up, it isn't going to make anything. Then we started getting these rains 1st of August, and it just took off. And the yields were really quite good on some of that. Where corn, it would have just been too late. So anyway, that's kind of the quick story on silage sorghum versus corn. How much less water does it use? We talk about 30% less than corn. That's for maximum production. Really where the savings comes in on silage sorghum is if you plant one of these early to medium maturity hybrids. If you plant a full season, you're going to use pretty close to the amount of water you're going to use on corn. So kind of keep that in mind. If you're thinking about going to silage sorghum, that's for water savings. You really need to plant more of these early maturing hybrids. Yes, you're giving up maybe some in yield, but there's some that do yield pretty good, or maybe one of those medium maturity. So how much water are we actually saving? Well, if you just kind of do the math on this, the early medium versus the full, that's 20 days. In this particular study, I used 1/4 of an inch a day, 5 inches. 5 inches of water savings on that. Okay, so that's kind of the difference in it. Again, we could talk a lot more about that, but we're not going to. Thought I'd spend more time on seeding rate and really going to just kind of focus on how we go about deriving a seeding rate for sorghum. For maximum yield potential, I think we've got to look at the factors that impact yield. You've heard me and others talk about these before, but there's basically 3 things, not surprisingly. Seed per panicle is the biggest one. That's the biggest contributor to your yield. On dry land, number of panicles is also going to be important, especially as you get into higher yields. At some point, you just got to have more panicles out there, right? Seed weight, surprisingly, does not make up that much of the yield difference. It does make a difference, especially in those higher yielding environments, I think, particularly on the seed weight, but it's not nearly as important as the seed per head or panicle. And this is some really good data from Kansas State from a few years back, but this is looking at grain yield and then the number of seed per head. Clearly a very strong correlation on that. The bigger that head is, the more kernels you have, the higher the yield's going to be. So very strong correlation, not too surprising. So number of heads per acre. What impacts the number of heads per acre? What are some things, guys, that impact number of heads per acre? Tillering, yep. Rain, which is going to drive some tillering and a lot of other things. Population. What you're seeding rate to begin with, is going to make a big difference. Germination and emergence, how well does it come up? Okay, I could probably list several other kind of sub things that affect, especially the tillering, which are several things that affect tillering. But the one thing that we can certainly control is our seeding rate. So it is important that we kind of get that right. And to some extent, we can maybe control germination and emergence if we have the soil prepared right and those sort of things. Tillering is much more hard. It's much more of a wild card. You'll talk to the seed companies and they say, oh yeah, this one tillers a whole lot less than this one. I don't know. They all seem to tiller to me under the right conditions. But you can influence that some. Tillers per plant. And usually if I ask this question, most people think that sorghum plant tillers a lot more than it probably does if you actually get out there and start counting tillers. Because one plant might have 3, and then the next one next to it has 0. And so, how does it average out? Well, it actually averages out at about 1.3 tillers per plant is what it would average out at. Now that's going to be affected again by a lot of things. You kind of see the range there that you're dealing with, but that's the average in this big survey that they did a few years ago in Kansas. Seed weight, so talked about that, doesn't contribute that much, pretty flat line. You'd think maybe it'd make a bigger difference than it does, but it's really pretty flat on that seed weight and yield. So seed number per panicle, if that's what is so important, what goes into that? How do we affect that seed number per panicle? One thing, we want to minimize the pre-flowering stress, okay? Especially that 30 to 45 days in there. That's when this head is beginning to form, okay? And that seed number potential is being formed. So that's important that it not stress during that period. What's going to affect that? Well, clearly water, the water availability. How much water do we have in the soil? We'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's something we have maybe some control on, or at least we know what that is going into the year, and we can affect our seeding rate. Weed control, particularly pre-plant. How much water are we going to have being stored in that soil? Insect and diseases, that's going to affect that germination and emergence. We want to make sure we get a good stand on what we do plant, and then to some extent nitrogen certainly and phosphorus availability I think comes into play on that, on how good a stand we're going to eventually get. We want to match that seeding rate to our yield potential. That's the whole point really of this conversation. Your soil. What is your water holding capacity of your soil? That's very important that you know that. That's your bank. That's what's going to make the yield on a dry land situation in most years. You might be pretty dry during the season, but if you have a good soil type and have a good profile of water, that goes a long way in making that yield. Sorghum requires roughly 6-7 inches of water to get to the point that it starts making grain. Once you get to that point and you add an inch from rainfall or irrigation, really bumps that yield up. But if you have that water stored in your soil initially, it's going to make a big difference. So know your soil type, know how much water you can hold per foot. And if you have a deep soil and you're lucky enough that you got a silty loam or a silty clay loam soil type, you may be very well holding over 2 inches of available water per foot. That's available water. So we'll say you've got 4 foot of good profile, that's 8 inches of available water you're going to have to that plant. That is just something that's critical to know prior to planting, so maybe you can adjust your seeding rate based off how much water you have in that soil that's going to be available. Another thing that's clearly going to affect that water that you're going to have in the soil is going to be your winter and spring weed control. I actually just wrote something on that. If you happen to see the High Plains Journal this a couple of days ago, this article appeared in that. I've got that handout up here where I talk about different weed control or herbicides for weed control during the winter and early spring. I think atrazine in most soil conditions, maybe the really sandy soil, not so much, but on your clay loam type soils, atrazine is going to be a clear something you've got to think about using, I think, for winter weed control. Dicamba surprisingly works well in the winter. You tend to think of that as for post-emergence weed control only, but it actually has pretty good soil activity, really good soil activity when soil temperatures are cool. It doesn't break down very fast, so it actually stays down pretty long, for a fairly long time under those conditions. Now, middle of the summer, it's going to break down pretty quick in the soil, but not so much in the winter under those cool conditions. So it actually makes a very nice product to have in that tank, not only for from a post-emergent standpoint, but even from a soil residual standpoint. If you've got kochia that's already up, then you probably need to add fluroxapyr in that. That's your starane. There's other names it goes by, but that's our best kochia product. Sharpen, good burn down product, but also has some good soil residual for some of those broadleaf weeds. So Sharpen makes a nice tank mix to go in maybe with your atrazine. Doesn't last a long time in the soil, so you can actually use that fairly close or really close to planting. PXR is a newer product that is effective, especially on mare's tail. If that happens to be a weed that you've got, the XR just seems to be great on mare's tail. And so that's one that I wanted to mention that's grown in popularity. Your Flumi, Valor is the typical trade name. There's others gotten to be very popular as a burn down, but also gives you some residual on broadleaf weeds. You can use Valor up to, I think the label is 30 days prior to sorghum planting. We've certainly seen people do it closer to planting. You might kind of watch that rate. If you're getting, say, within a week or two from planting, I'd probably lower that rate some. You can get some injury to the sorghum, but that's certainly become a pretty popular product. If you've got grass in that you're trying to control during the winter, then you're probably going to add glyphosate. Scoparia is one I thought I would just mention real quickly. That's used a fair amount when you're going back to corn. Corn is tolerant to that herbicide. Isoxafluto is the active ingredient of that. Balance is what you might be more familiar with it, but it is used a lot before corn planting. Really, there's quite a pretty good risk on sorghum because of that 6-month rotation restriction with that herbicide. Again, I've got a handout up here if you want to pick that up on winter and early spring weed control. Okay, kind of back to seed number per head, okay? So what is the average number of seed that you have on a sorghum head, okay? Look at this data, again, really good data set from Kansas State. Approximately 2,000 seed per head is the average number on average size head, okay, that you're going to have. So that's a good number to know. You can see how that can vary. You can get up to 3,500, okay, seed per head, and I've certainly seen that. You can get that, and that's greatly going to increase yield. Seed weight that we talked about earlier, much more variable really to some extent, but the average is about 21 grams per 1,000 seed is the way that's measured. That's the average. But a lot of the seed weight will be around that 24 grams per 1,000. And that's probably, in my mind, a better number to use typically than maybe that mean when you're calculating yield. So average panicle weight is about 1/10 of the pound. That's the average weight of any given sorghum head. Because that takes into account that 2,000 kernels and that mean on the how much they're going to weigh. If you go up to 24 grams, it really doesn't change it that much. Okay, this is a good example of why that weight doesn't influence the yield that much. It goes to 0.106, but roughly, 1/10 of a pound is a good number to use. If I go to your farm and I'm going to get a quick estimate of yield, what I'm going to do is mark off, the length that I need to for your row spacing. So 4 inches for a 30-inch row. I'm going to mark that off or step it off, and then I'm going to count heads. Okay, and I'm going to assume that those are 1/10 of a pound, and that's going to give me a quick reference on what that yield's going to be. Now, if I look at that and I think, hey, that's a pretty big head, then I may go to 0.12 and multiply it by that, or if you really got some nice heads, maybe 0.14, and that'll give me a rough estimate of your yield. Okay, it's what I use. But that's a nice number to kind of remember. And that will influence, I think, to some extent our seeding rate. Match seeding rate to yield potential. That's what this is all about. You know, all these slides that I've just talked about kind of lead up to. Important to know, and you guys know this, the number of seed per pound of that bag of seed you're buying can vary a lot. Typically 13,000 to 16,000 is what you'll see on a grain sorghum bag. You get into the silage sorghums, and particularly the Sudans, it could be 12,000 to 20,000. Huge difference, okay? You need to know that. We just did a quick survey here recently, and it was asking growers, do you plant based off number of seed per acre, or do you use pounds per acre? And I was very surprised at how many growers are still using pounds per acre, okay? We really need to get away from that. You know, know the number of seed that you're planting, because that can make a big difference. So seeding rate and yield potential, dry land or limited irrigation, we assume a 68% stand or emergence, if you will. Y'all are probably thinking that's too low. The bag says I've got 85% germ. Actually, it's probably closer to 95% germ on good seed. That seed is going to germinate. Now, just because it germinates doesn't mean it's going to come up, okay? So you'll see that 85% number. But with sorghum, you know, getting small seed, things kind of happen to it. Under dry land conditions, you're seldom planting under ideal conditions. And so kind of what the research has shown, about 68% stand establishment, okay? That may seem low. And if you're planting under really good conditions and you know that, then I'd probably bump that up to 75%. But I wouldn't count on much better than that on emergence. And the higher your seeding rate is, actually the less that's going to be. You wouldn't think it'd make much difference. But for example, if you're really trying to push yields under irrigation and you're planting 100,000 seed, I guarantee you you're not getting anywhere close to 100,000 up, especially on 30-inch rows. And I don't know why that is, but it is. So we've got to do the math on this. You look, if your seeding rate is 50,000, and you use that 0.68, but we are going to have some tillering. So I say 1.3 tillering, that gives us 44,000. Okay, and I think that's pretty reasonable. Sorghum has that ability though to adjust. It can either adjust by, again, more tillers if you're very thin, or that sorghum, we're talking about corn here flexing. The sorghum head also can flex, if you will. Okay, and you can have a much bigger head, again, a lot more kernels per head. And that's what this kind of demonstrates here. If we go on that sorghum weight, so if we're down to 0.08 pounds per head, we're going to potentially yield 63 bushels with that planting, that number of heads per acre out there. If we go to that average, 0.1, well now we jumped up to 80. Okay, just from the flexing, if you will, of that sorghum head. Or again, you can see the numbers there, how we continue to go up with that bigger head. So sorghum is, I don't know if it's really unique, but it certainly very much has that ability to adjust, okay, which is a good thing. But we need to consider that when we're looking at our seeding rate. So the interaction of heads per acre for seed number per head. So you got 40,000 versus 80,000 heads out there. You can actually have roughly the same yield, okay, depending on the conditions there. If you look at that purple bar on a 40,000, but you've got some good conditions, obviously, and you have 3,000 kernels per head. You've got a bigger head, roughly 110 bushels. 60,000 head, again, the population's more, so a little more stress on those plants. You don't have as big a head, but you still yield roughly 110 bushels. Same thing at 80,000. Okay, so sorghum really can make a difference there. Now, from a management standpoint, how do I take this and use it? Well, again, knowing that how much water you've got in your soil, if it's you got 1 foot of moisture, that's all you've got. Okay, well, I'm thinking, and the forecast is for it going to be dry, okay, for the next 2 months. Well, I'm going to probably lower my seeding rate significantly. So I may go down to 40,000 where normally I'd go 60,000. I'm going to back it off, knowing that I still have good potential okay, to at least give me a decent yield if conditions do turn out to be good, but yet I don't have so many plants out there that's gonna burn up. So that's one way you can think about this and adjust your seeding rate. So all of that leads to this one slide, and if I were, covering a lot more subjects today rather than just seeding rate, this is the only slide I would have shown. But this is kind of what I think is a good recommendation on seeding rate based off your yield potential. Okay, so what do you think that year, given the conditions you have, what do you think your yield potential could be? So we'll just take that 50,000 seeding rate there. Again, because of tillering and the ability of that head to vary in size, that can be 90 to 140 bushels. Okay, is the yield potential on that. So nice range there. If I think I've got better yield potential, then I may go up to 70,000. Or again, if I don't, I'm going to back off that. So this is what I think would generally work pretty well for you. If you happen to be in the yield contest and you're under irrigation, then I'm going to bump that seeding rate way up because I'm going to be putting water on it, so those plants are not going to stress. And you start doing the math on how many panicles you've got to have out there, and you've got to have a bunch of them. So if I'm really going to shoot for, say, that 240 bushel, I'm really going to go for it, and I've got the conditions to do that, then really I'm going to probably plant about 120,000 seed, okay, to try to get there. But most of us aren't trying to do that, and we want to be conservative, I think, on our seeding rate, especially on dry. Any questions on seeding rate? So I've covered them. Usually don't go into near that much detail on how we come up with that number, but I would today.
Dr. B, are all those based on 30 inches, or would you?
Yeah, that's a good question. On row spacing, yeah, it's more or less based off 30-inch rows. If I'm going to say a 15 or 20-inch row, and I've got good conditions, I'm probably going to lean towards the higher side of that seeding rate. So I might adjust it 20% off what maybe I normally would do under those conditions, but I'm going to plant a little higher seeding rate on a more narrow row typically. Is what I would do. Now, again, if it's a dry year, then I may not change it much at all. But typically, I think with a more narrow row, you can and it will help you to get with a little bit of higher seeding rate on that. Not going to talk about varieties today, but these are, you think you guys know this. This is where you can find variety information for Nebraska, and which is a good resource to have. Quickly on herbicide technologies, we've got 3 of them, as I think most of you know. We've got the Enzyme, the iGrowth, and the Double Team. These are the answer to your grass problem. They really are. We can control grass down in sorghum, and before this we really couldn't. I mean, we would try to do some things, but we really couldn't. So this has really kind of answered that problem. These are the 3 technologies. You've got, again, the iGrowth, the Enzyme, and your Double Team. Just start with the Enzyme, that's Pioneers. Corteva sells the product Zest, which is nickel sulfuron, which is the old accent herbicide. You guys may have used that in corn. Been very little seed available of that until this year. If you're looking for a Pioneer hybrid, they probably have it this year.
That's still not available in Nebraska, neither is the herbicide. I tried that.
Really? That is surprising.
I've been told what Pioneer rep, you cannot get it in the state of Nebraska. You cannot get that. Nutrient says they can't get the herbicide out there. I've been trying for the last 4 years to get it since University of Nebraska. Tried that stuff 5 years ago. Put it in their weed guidebook. I've been trying to get it for a university farm. Not set it up.
That's
And
good to know.
I don't want it for research. I just want it for standard production.
Yeah.
I can't get it because I've got sander issues.
Yeah.
Amy Fletch worked really good for me the last 3 years, but I gotta rotate away from it this year because I can't.
Yeah.
My rotations in our fields, I can rotate away from it for 2 years. So
Did they give you a reason why you should get it?
it's only in the region where they have a producer, did research on it in Texas, and those producers buy all of it in that area. I mean, they buy the whole supply for the year. It's all sold in that area. So is the Zest herbicide. Nutrient, my rep, Nutrient rep called down
Yeah, that's really surprising to me because there hasn't been much of that planted in the panhandle.
Guys at Western Harvest Days about it too. Well, yeah, it's a real tight supply. It's why they're gonna get out of Texas for a while.
Yeah, it's been very tight, but this year they've told me they have significant. I'm gonna call Pioneer about that and some of the people higher up and say, why isn't this available in
The
Nebraska?
availability this year is to get at the dealers, they just do a dealer transfer, they get it from transfer from a dealer in Kansas. So they're currently not shipping it, company's not shipping it to Nebraska.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
I had to do that for Asper seeds.
So I go down in Newton to get my Asper seed that I wanted, because Asper cut it off up here in Nebraska.
Dr. B, that's a conversation we can have with leadership at Quantum Crossing Intermediate.
Yeah, if not before, but we'll definitely rattle some cages on that, because they tell me they have a decent supply, especially of the one hybrid that should be
On
used.
the flip side of this, I got on our extension because they left Imiflex out for the last 3 years. It's been available in Nebraska for the last 4 years, I think. It was never in our weed guide books.
Yeah.
So I harped on them this year about it. And I basically said, you gotta put in the book, if you got Inzen in there and we can't get it, Imiflex better show up in that book this
Yeah.
year. Or I'm gonna be driving on some other cages. And you're
Yeah.
gonna like it. So.
Okay, we
it's
just
in
had a
the book
meeting with
this
Advana
year.
this last week, and if I'd have known that, we would have brought that up. These were their global leaders. I mean, we could have rattled some cages there.
Well, look, I got told from the regional guys, I can't get it yet.
Wow, okay.
And that's not my local dealer. My
Yeah.
local dealer has been trying for years, and he said he got stumped every time he tried calling in. He's the territorial guy in Eastern Nebraska.
Good to know. Good to know. We'll definitely
It's all
pass
hot
that on.
subject for me, sorry.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you telling me that. That's something we need to know.
Well, the other producers use this stuff. They got issues like I've got. I got grass pressure,
Yeah.
I gotta get rid of.
Yeah,
I wiped out my whole milo crops through 3 years ago. Sandburg came in, looked like a carpet, blew it all out, Roundup, replanted, did it again, I blew it all out, replanted the soybeans.
yeah.
I couldn't do anything else with it because I didn't have any of these products at the time.
So were you able to get the double team?
I haven't used it yet, I've been using them
Okay,
so,
all right,
and it did a good job. So, I mean,
yeah,
wasn't as good as, well, pre wasn't as good as post. I tried some pre,
Okay.
but the post worked better coming in late with it.
Yeah.
So,
okay, good,
yeah,
yeah.
everything
Good.
came up.
Yeah, appreciate that.
I did first act a lot on Felix Amber late, and it worked very good.
Yeah, I mean,
It did, and of course you got to do it all by itself, but
Yeah.
that first act did a very good job on the Felix Amber.
yeah, my experience, and we've looked at a lot of data, a lot of tests on these, and Nebraska's looked at this too. We've sponsored trials with Amit and others. But yeah, I think all three of these technologies do really a good job on most of these grasses. On Sandburr, they do a good job. Tumble windmill grass is the one that I think maybe the double team or the first act maybe is better on. Another one is Texas panicum or Colorado grass, which I don't know y'all have much of. It's maybe a little bit different. But I think they all three do a good job, basically, especially on your foxtails and your more common grasses. So which one of these technologies you use, I think that, they're gonna work for you. But there are some differences in these, so I'll quickly kind of go over that. Again, I could spend a lot more time on this, but the iGrowth and the Enzyme, they are both ALS inhibitors, but they're different subclasses. And so you can have cross resistance with these. And so one of my concerns about the Imiflex would be, and the Zest too for that matter, Zest is a sulfonylurea. We know we've got some tolerance to that, especially with Johnson grass and probably some shattercane. Okay, and so if it's resistant to SUs, it's going to be resistant to Zest herbicide. Okay, it may not be, but there's a good chance that I could also be resistant to the Imiflex because they are ALS, even though they're different subclasses. So that's something to kind of keep in mind.
Amiflex is the old Raptor herbicide we used to use
Yep.
in soybeans. So
Yep.
you've got issues then with your shattercane.
Yeah.
It showed back up, so.
Yeah, so if y'all didn't hear that, Raptor is the product, is the Imaflex in soybeans. So if you're familiar with that in soybeans, that's what that is. The Imaflex does have soil activity, you know, as was mentioned. So you can use it either pre or post. The other two you're not going to be able to do that with. It does have pretty good pre-activity actually, but the labeled rate for pre is 9 ounces. The post rate is 6 ounces. Significant number of dollars there. Plus, if it's me, I would just as soon use my Group 15 herbicides, your acetochlor and tolochlor and dimethenamide as my pre. And I really haven't seen where Imaflex is much better than those. They're all kind of depends, but for the most part, it's about the same. So let's go ahead and use our Group 15 herbicides like we've been doing, or combine it with atrazine, bicep, full time. Use that pre, and then come back post with your Imaflex is the way I would do it. Okay, on that. Some broadleaf activity, but if you're counting on it to control your palmer amaranth, it isn't going to do it. It may help you a little bit, but you know, think of it mostly as grass. Crop rotation restrictions, that can be a concern. Going back to wheat is my main concern on that. If you were to double crop wheat behind Imaflex, I have seen a field have to be replanted because of that. The label is really kind of confusing. If you look at the label, there's some fine print in there, but basically if you don't get at least 10 inches of rainfall or irrigation, then that rotation restriction to wheat jumps to 15 months rather than, I think it's 4 months. And that's significant on that. So keep that in mind. Now you can go back with what's called Clearfield wheat that has that same trait tolerance. You can do that with that if you wanted to do it that way. But we wouldn't really recommend that for stewardship reasons. The double team, that's going to be a completely different mode of action. That's your ACCAs. If you're familiar with Assure, that's the same thing as what First Act is. So very proven record with that product. Another good thing about this group of herbicides, ACCAs, is we've had very little resistance to those yet. Now, just saw a presentation in Kansas that the weed scientist there Sarah did it just recently, and at least South Dakota is beginning to pick up some resistance to ACCAs, which is unfortunate. But historically, we just haven't seen much. So I think that's a possible advantage to that. And there's really no rotational restrictions. If you look at the Alta or the Avana hybrids that are available, there's basically 3 of them. The one that we probably have the most data on is the 2168. So that's the one that I tend to recommend. For dryland, under irrigation or better conditions, probably this 2193 might be a better choice. Sugarcane aphid is not a big deal in Nebraska at all, but they do have, those last 2 do have good sugarcane aphid tolerance. We're looking at the yield data on these, and I'd be curious of your experience with that. When these first came out, Alta had a problem. It was a very dry year, and they had a lot of fields that just flat failed with their product. Gave them a black eye on that. I don't think they had the hybrids placed very good, and they had some issues. And they're having a hard time overcoming that. But I do think the 2168, probably the 2193 are good hybrids to look at again. Where I've seen yield trials, they've been okay in those yield trials. Again, curious if y'all have any experience with those. But that's what I would choose from an Alta standpoint. Those are the 3 that should be available to you. Double team, 3830 and 45A45 have a pretty good track record. So from a dryland standpoint, these are what are particularly used in eastern Colorado. They really like the 3830 in eastern Colorado under those very dry conditions. 45A45 has actually done pretty well in eastern Colorado because they've had some decent rains this last year or 2. And it'll actually probably out yield a 3830 under those types of conditions. So again, for Nebraska conditions, again, if you've got that full profile of water, I might think about the 45A45 because it has, again, a little more yield potential. And then probably this last one, the 65B21 under irrigation or as you move east, I think would be a good choice under better conditions. And for the most part, people have been pleased with the double team yields. I think they were a little bit later in getting their hybrids to the market. And I think it kind of paid off for them. They didn't put something out there that, you know, got a black eye right out of the chute. So that's what's available from that standpoint.
Dr. B,
Yeah.
sorry. Next to yield, what's their standability? What kind of legs do they have?
That's a good question. Lodging on these, and I haven't seen much data on that or heard many people mention that they've had an issue with it. So I'm assuming decent standability. It's a good question, and I should probably check on, but no one has mentioned to me they've had an issue with lodging with those.
Because in western Kansas,
Yeah.
if it's not up,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter for
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
Or makes it tougher.
Yeah, good question. Another thing about the double team, this is some data from Nebraska. I think I shared last year, but you can't mix First Act with a broadleaf herbicide, really any of them. But certainly 2,4-D and Clarity, because you have this antagonistic effect and the grass control can just drop to nothing. Now that can vary, but in this trial you see how it affected that. So unfortunately, you just can't mix the First Act with a broadleaf herbicide. Now you can the Imoflex, you can mix it, seems to be just fine. Same thing with the Zest, you can mix it and not have an issue, but you can't with the First Act.
Do you know how those three yielded? Like with 2,4-D and without?
No, I don't. In most of these trials, we didn't take them to yield or couldn't get yield data, but that's a
I
good
always feel
question.
like it kind of pauses it for a couple weeks if you spray 2,4-D.
Oh, just the 2,4-D effect on it?
Yeah.
You think it's a positive effect?
No.
Okay. Yeah. If it's positive,
If you can avoid
you're
it, that's good too. And I mean
Yeah.
that would factor into how
Yeah.
bad you want to complete control.
Yeah, and we got some extra time here, so I'll talk about 2,4-D and dicamba. But they're good herbicides to use in sorghum if you've got to use them. But to your point, they can hurt yield, and sometimes they hurt yield even when you don't realize. You don't think, plant's leaning a little bit, no big deal. Still stood up at harvest, so again, wouldn't hurt. But if you actually compare the yields, where you didn't use the 2,4-D or the dicamba, you actually, in some cases, do lower the yield significantly. And so if you can get by without using 2,4-D or dicamba, you're better off. What I like to do when I recommend using 2,4-D or dicamba is I want to mix it with something else. Maybe with atrazine. You guys probably don't use peak out here much, but peak or even some other, buctril and atrazine, if you were mixing it with that, I want to lower that 2,4-D or dicamba amount. Usually I use dicamba with that mix, and so instead of going at that full 8-ounce rate, I'm going to lower it to 4 ounces, maybe even 2 ounces, and that'll eliminate most of that injury to sorghum, but yet still boost your weed control. Is the way I like to use those two products. But this kind of just drives home that point. In the trials that I've looked at and evaluated, 21 trials where I've looked at where they put 2,4-D in with First Act, over 50% of the time you have at least a noticeable difference in control. 20% of the time it's like that slide I just showed you where it's dramatic. Okay, instead of having a 15% reduction in control, you've got 75% reduction in control. So it can be dramatic. So, if you want to roll the dice on putting 2,4-D in there, these are your odds. Okay, on doing it. Dicamba is somewhat less, but still significant on that. Zest. So there's two products that they have, and they're all fairly long maturity. Okay, so the 85Z65 is supposed to be the High Plains variety. It's 7 days to bloom, so it's a longer maturing hybrid. Probably not going to use it out here in western Nebraska, but as you move east, it would be a probably a pretty good one. And, you know, Pioneer, they're a bigger company, they're very slow in getting their hybrids to the market. But once they're in the market, they're usually pretty good hybrids. And so, even though I haven't seen much yield data on this, it's probably a pretty good yielding variety. Wouldn't be surprised at all. You know, the Z65. Unfortunately, you can't get it up here, but we're going to talk to some people about that. But this is the first year that they've really had any sizable inventory. Last year they didn't have any, so it doesn't surprise me too much last year. But this year, I'm surprised you can't get that herbicide or get that product. It's probably going to be another 3 years before they come out with more of an earlier maturing hybrid that would fit more of the western Nebraska areas. That's probably what we're looking at. Seed cost. So this is going to be an add-on cost. You're not going to take away anything that you're already doing or shouldn't. You're still going to use your pre-emergence herbicide. You're still going to need a broadleaf herbicide, maybe post-emergence. So it's not going to take away from anything. So this is add-on cost. So clearly you're not going to want to use this in all likelihood unless you have a serious grass problem. And that's where they're going to pay. And that's where they're going to be well worth it. The cost on these 3 technologies, and I'll make some various assumptions here because seed costs can really vary depending on a lot of factors, but making some assumptions here, the cost is roughly the same on these technologies. When you add in the herbicide cost and the seed cost, they're roughly the same. So it just depends on which technology that you want to use on these. So roughly $20 an acre is probably what you ought to figure that this is going to cost you. We've already talked about these rotational restrictions. I didn't say much about the Imiflex. Well, I did say some about it, but right now the rotational restriction going back to sorghum, if you want to do continuous sorghum, is 18 months. They're working to change that, and they put that on there for stewardship reasons, but really, they probably do need to change that, and they will. They'll get that changed eventually where you can rotate. If you want to plant continuous sorghum, you can do that. But if you do that from a stewardship standpoint, it's going to be really important you rotate those technologies. So use your double team, maybe the first year, and then come back with the iGrowth or the Enzen. Rotate those technologies because we've got to control, especially shattercane and Johnson grass. We've got to control those, and some of these other grasses too, for that matter. And rotating that technology is actually a very good way of doing that. Got some of these little pamphlets in the front, stewardship for this is the wrong one. This is a different brochure for sugarcane aphids. So we've got to get you another little book that looks almost identical to this. That's for stewardship. It goes into a lot of things. I could spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking about that. But there are things we can do to make sure this technology lasts. If we don't, I guarantee you in 5 years we're going to start seeing resistance showing up, especially of shattercane. Johnson grass, that cross between Johnson grass and sorghum is actually pretty hard to happen. It can happen, and it will happen, but it's much less than shattercane. So if shattercane particularly is the grass that's around your area, your farm, or in your farm, in your field, we've got to pay attention to. I'll add another slide there. But the key is we don't want that shattercane or Johnson grass to be flowering the same time our sorghum is. So if your sorghum is beginning to start blooming, or say it's in the boot stage and you're there, it's going to happen in the next week. Check your fields. If you got shattercane in and or around that field, hoe it, mow it, spray it, do something, but keep it from flowering at the same time, or we're going to have pollen. And we're going to have a problem, okay? So if we want this technology to last, pay attention to those things. Pick up that booklet, and we'll get you some more of those booklets. And I should have brought some, but it goes into more things to consider from a stewardship standpoint.
I think that's definitely one thing we've learned with some of our other chemicals that we have access to for our other crops, is how important the stewardship is, the rates, the timing, and everything. So hopefully, we all know how hard it was to get them, so for sorghum. So thank you for your efforts on that. Do you know when you might have the growing degree days information when it might be released?
Probably about 4 years from now.
Oh, I'm gonna have a hard time finding that note. Bring that up again next time for us and,
Yeah, we're just
keep us
starting
posted.
that. I mean, we could talk about the formula we use now, and if you look at I don't know about Nebraska, but the Kansas State, if you look at their Messinet system,
Yes.
they use a formula that everybody else uses, and it shows up in a publication actually that I wrote 25 years ago. And it shows up because, and just kind of the history behind this a little bit is we were writing a growth and development publication. And we got to the end of it, and the guy was writing it, we said, hey, why don't you throw in heat units? I said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Because I knew that USDA out there at Bush and Amarillo was working on that, and they were tracking this. And they had an early medium maturity hybrid, and they had a full maturity hybrid. And so I mostly looked at the early medium maturity data because that's what we were planning around there. So we published this data. And within 2 months after it had been published, you could look at that and say, clearly this is not right, especially on the full season stuff. Okay, it just wasn't right. And that publication and that data has literally shown up all over the world. So you never know where, but the Messinet uses that in Kansas, and I know it's not right. And even on the early to medium stuff, I think it's better, but from what I've seen in planting these same hybrids in different places, it really varies. So there's more than just heat units that's affecting this. And so that's why we just need to figure that out. And so before my career completely ends, I want to correct a mistake that I helped make many years ago.
Way back then. I love it. Well, let's give him a round of applause and thank you.